Indiana football season is over. Welcome to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. I'm Nick Rodecap with you on this Sunday morning, and man, the historic run that Curt Cignetti's team went on in year number one came to a close in South Bend on Friday night. It was a game that Indiana never really had a chance in. I was up there in South Bend covering the game along with some of my fellow student media members, and I mean, aside from the interception that Indiana forced on Notre Dame's first drive, the Hoosiers really didn't have anything going for them until very late in that game. And I think at the time of the game, we thought maybe the committee got it wrong. Some people did. I didn't. But some people thought the College Football Playoff Selection Committee may have gotten things wrong by selecting Indiana, an 11-1 Big Ten team that, according to some, didn't play anybody. But as we saw yesterday throughout the college football playoff, maybe, just maybe, the lower-seeded teams are worse than the higher-seeded teams. It's a novel concept, I know, but the 12-team playoff is off to an interesting start across the college football landscape. Every single higher-seeded team won, which it almost is like that's supposed to happen, but don't tell that to people like Colin Cowherd, because according to him, Indiana had no business ever getting into the playoff. But that's an interesting story that we may dive into a little bit later. Indiana, though, they finished their regular season 11-2 on the gridiron, falling 27-17 to Notre Dame, although that final score is kind of misleading because Notre Dame let off the gas defensively in the fourth quarter. Indiana scored a pair of touchdowns and a two-point conversion, but at one point it was 27-3. Up in South Bend. By the way, credit to the folks at Notre Dame. It was a heck of an atmosphere. The press box food was great, by the way. And overall, a fantastic experience getting to cover a college football playoff game. Obviously, if you're Indiana, you wish the result would have gone a little better. But you look at the big picture for the Hoosiers, and I think it's important to remember, Aiden Fisher said this in the press conferences after the game. It's important to remember what path Indiana was on at this time last year, just firing their head coach, whom they had extended not even 4 years prior after a strong season during COVID, firing the head coach, cleaning house, everybody's in the portal. Indiana was going nowhere at this time last year. And then for them to completely flip the program on its head, them being, of course, Curt Cignetti and his coaching staff and the players that came in, those that stuck around from the Tom Allen era, for them to completely flip the paradigm of this program on its head in a year and to get Indiana onto the biggest stage in the college football playoff is something that should be commended. Curt Cignetti, obviously, winning numerous Coach of the Year awards for his efforts, as he should. I think it's really easy, especially right now, to let recency bias sort of wreck your perception of a given team, a given program, but you got to look big picture here. Curt Cignetti did what he said he was going to do, which is change the way people think about Indiana football. He has certainly done that in just 1 year. And keep in mind, he just inked an 8-year contract extension prior to the Ohio State game. It was during the bye week that he signed that contract extension, 8 years. He said, we're in the emerging superpower of college football, which some people disagreed with. But the fact is, he said it. And Curt Cignetti is one to say some things that people, find a little bit outlandish, yes. But he said, why would I leave? And he certainly put pen to paper. And, a lot of people will say that Curt Cignetti wrote some checks his mouth couldn't cash. And I was one of those after the Ohio State game. I said that in a column that I wrote for the Hoosier Network, which I stand by. I do think that he didn't do himself any favors again on Friday with what he said on College Game Day about how Indiana handled top 25 teams a certain way. There is technically a caveat that Indiana did play a top 25 team in Nebraska because Nebraska was, I believe, 25th or 24th in the coaches poll at the time that Indiana played them and beat them 56-7. But there were no AP top 25 teams. There were no teams ranked in the college football playoff top 25 at the time Indiana played them and won. Indiana, of course, played Ohio State, Notre Dame, lost to both. So definitely some people, came out of the woodwork. A lot of people did, actually, and sort of came at Curt Cignetti for what he said and then subsequently how he coached against both Ohio State, but especially Notre Dame. One play in particular, Indiana down 3 scores with about 10 and a half minutes left in the game. Indiana on the Notre Dame side of the 50 decided to punt, which in a vacuum looks like a very bad decision. You think about the surrender index, which is basically, okay, it takes into account down and distance, score, time left in the game, and then if you're punting, okay, you're basically, how much are you conceding this game by punting in this situation? Indiana punting down 3 scores, very late in the game, relatively speaking. On the other side of the 50, very high on the surrender index. But Cignetti said after the game that, the offense was dead in the water. It was going nowhere. They were doing nothing. And he felt like the defense had some momentum, which, to be fair, Indiana's defense really did have momentum. So he wanted to trust Indiana's defense to get a stop. And, you look at the overall numbers for Indiana's defense on Friday against Notre Dame. And outside of the 98-yard touchdown run by Jeremiah Love, which was one of the craziest plays I have ever seen in person on a football field, Indiana held Notre Dame to under 100 yards rushing. Now, obviously, again, if I had wheels, I'd be a bicycle. But you take away the one huge play, which was the second longest run in the BCS postseason era, that 98-yard run by Jeremiah Love. You take that out of the equation, Indiana held Notre Dame to 95 yards rushing. And yeah, the defense definitely did have momentum because Riley Leonard passed for 201 yards, yes. But it wasn't like he was airing the ball out. It wasn't like he was, ripping it down the field 20, 30, 40 yards. That said, though, Indiana's defense did have its problems early in the game. The defensive backs in particular struggled. Jameer Johnson, Jamari Sharp, Bryson Bond, Sean Asbury all got burned at one point or another. And it was on that 98-yard run by Jeremiah Love in particular. Aiden Fisher said after the game that it was a mismatch on Indiana's front seven that led to that. Jeremiah Love just hit the hole and he went. And you look at the replay and Sean Asbury's lined up as an edge rusher. And Indiana wanted to be aggressive in that situation, but they said they were not aggressive enough, which is unfortunate because Jeremiah Love doesn't need a lot of space before he is off to the races. But it does speak to a broader issue that Indiana will have to address moving forward. Good coaching, obviously Curt Cignetti and his staff, a very good coaching staff. Don't get it twisted. But good coaching will only take you so far without high-end talent. And that is what we've seen throughout the first round of the college football playoff over the last couple days. Every single higher seed winning, and Indiana's margin of defeat was actually the closest. Was the closest of every single first-round game. I know those garbage time points changed the stat line a little bit, but the facts are the facts. Indiana only lost by 10. Clemson lost by 14. SMU by 28. And Tennessee by 25 points against Ohio State last night, which was really funny. Really funny because Ole Miss head coach Lane Kiffin, of course, was talking all over Twitter about how, the committee did a really poor job and should have let more SEC teams in because all these other teams weren't putting up good fights. And then Tennessee goes in and they're down 21-0 to Ohio State after the first quarter. Lane Kiffin didn't say much after that, but there's a lot more to get into, talking about Indiana's first-round exit in the college football playoff and the CFP as a whole. We'll talk about it a little bit more coming up here on IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you, talking not just about Indiana's loss in the first round of the college football playoff, but also the first round as a whole, because the big picture is very interesting. If you take a look at the way these games played out around the country over the last couple days, Indiana, of course, falling by 10 to Notre Dame, and we thought, as in people, a lot of ESPN talking head types around the country, we thought that, maybe the Indiana Hoosiers didn't belong in the college football playoff because they lost by, 10 to Notre Dame. Now, it was 24 points until garbage time, but the final score was a 10-point margin of victory for Notre Dame. Lane Kiffin in particular was really going in on the anti-IU, the anti-Big Ten hate train, which was interesting because when Tennessee was down 21-0 to Ohio State after the first quarter of that game in Columbus last night, crickets from Lane Kiffin. The last thing he tweeted about college football was "Let's go Vols," because somebody took a video of the Tennessee Orange invasion in Columbus last night. Those fans did not go back down south happy. There was a lot of orange at the shoe, though. And so Kiffin tweets out that picture and says, "Let's go Vols," and then crickets. But when Indiana, of course, was losing, to Notre Dame, he tweets, "Really exciting competitive game at CFB playoff. Great job." It's the hypocrisy is astounding by people like Lane Kiffin. Obviously, I get it because he's an SEC coach and the SEC thinks they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. But Ohio State showed that that's not the case. Not even close anymore. And I think it's really, really interesting to see how this superiority mindset that everybody in the SEC has just taken a complete faceplant this year. And part of me wonders, now that paying your players is legal, maybe that advantage the SEC had for so long is gone. That's just me speculating, though. It was funny, though, when Shane Gillis went on College Game Day and said that basically Nick Saban, his advantage is gone because he can't pay everybody can pay their players now. But either way, you look at the Tennessee-Ohio State game, and man, Indiana put up more of a fight than Tennessee did against Ohio State in Columbus. Tennessee losing to Ohio State 42-17 a game. Again, that game was 21-0 after the first quarter. Nico Iamaleava, very poor performance from him. But according to Kirk Herbstreit, Nico's a very talented freshman that led Tennessee to 10 wins. But also according to Kirk Herbstreit, Indiana didn't deserve to be in the playoff because they apparently got waxed by Notre Dame. It's just, I understand why ESPN is saying it. I understand why they're trying to push this message that Indiana is supposedly the biggest fraud ever. And nobody else is fraudulent. Just Indiana. Just Indiana. It's because ESPN didn't get a slice of the Big Ten media deal. It's because they obviously are deep in the SEC's pockets. They're deep in the ACC's pockets, deep in the Big 12's pockets, but not the Big Ten. So, of course, they're going to defend their pride and joy in the Southeastern Conference. I get that. I understand that. But when the play on the field makes you eat your words, I think it's really funny. Because Tennessee, was a team that, we thought, okay, yeah, they should be in. The same way we thought Indiana should be in. And then Tennessee just had nothing last night against Ohio State. But according to ESPN, they somehow didn't deserve the hate that Indiana did. It's very interesting to look at the difference in the messaging, but nevertheless, Indiana's 10-point loss to Notre Dame ended up being the closest margin of victory for a team in the first round of the college football playoff. Again, Clemson by 14, SMU losing by 28, Tennessee losing by a lot. I mean, they lost 42-17 by 25. Indiana by 10. Garbage time, yes, Indiana by, it would have been, 24 if you take out those two late touchdowns, which still wouldn't have been the biggest margin of defeat. But, again, The fact that Indiana is even part of that discourse, is part of that discussion of, this team that made the playoff didn't belong, I think is really cool, because you've got people who are mad about Indiana football. Again, mad about historically one of the worst programs in the country, and that's all thanks to Curt Cignetti changing the way people think about Indiana football. But we talked about this a little bit before the break, about what Indiana needs to do moving forward, and I think the answer is pretty clear. They've got to attract higher-end talent, higher-end recruits. And to be clear, that doesn't mean going after every, bag hunter in the portal, everybody who's looking for a massive NIL payday. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that Indiana, you can only do so much with a bunch of Group of 5 All-Stars and a bunch of, Power 4 backups, if you will. Because let's face it, that's what most of Indiana's roster was this past season. Curtis Rourke, a MAC quarterback. Justice Ellison, a situational back at Wake Forest. Tyson Lawton, a Group of 5 type player. And the same goes for the defense as well. But again, Indiana's defense, by and large, actually did a pretty good job against Notre Dame. Without that Jeremiah Love 98-yard rip, which came down to a mismatch inside the tackle box, they held Notre Dame to under 300 yards of total offense, which I think you'll take against a team of that caliber any day of the week. But from high atop the press box at Notre Dame Stadium, one thing was very clear, and that was that Indiana's offensive line was just getting absolutely mauled in the trenches. And it wasn't like, Notre Dame was getting to Curtis Rourke a ton, but Rourke was definitely rattled on Friday. That was very clear from the jump. You could see him missing on some of these throws that he would usually hit. The short throws over the middle, a couple throws to the boundaries, one to Omar Cooper that was nowhere close, one to Elijah Surratt that would have been pass interference, but it was uncatchable, and thus did not get the pass interference penalty because it was so poorly thrown. That's something that we don't see from Curtis Rourke a lot. That inability to even get the ball in the same vicinity as the receiver, throwing just a couple ticks behind him. The throw, of course, to Keyshawn Williams that he tried to force over the middle, which was intercepted by Xavier Watts, the Bronco Nagurski Trophy winner and unanimous All-American from a year ago, who will probably be a first-round pick in the upcoming NFL draft. The Notre Dame safety who led them with 10 tackles, had the pick, had a quarterback hit, had a pass breakup. He was all over the place for the Irish on Friday night. But you look at what Rourke did, and it was very puzzling because he did not look like the poised pocket passer that we become accustomed to seeing throughout the season. And Notre Dame, made it very, very evident what Rourke's flaws are. You get to him once, you sack him once, you pick him off once, and he just kind of gets rattled. And you could see he had happy feet in the pocket. He was throwing off platform a lot, even when he didn't need to, which, led to his throws not flying through the air with enough zip on them, led to him just being a tick off. And, Indiana didn't really get a lot going through the passing game, and Indiana's been a pass-first team throughout the season. Now, Rourke did end up with 215 yards, but most of those came very late in the game in the fourth quarter when Notre Dame sort of backed off defensively, and they, didn't dial up as many complex looks in coverage, as many complex blitz packages as they had shown in the previous three quarters, and that was basically so that Georgia didn't have as much to look at on tape. Of course, Georgia waits for Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl coming up on New Year's Day. But it's very interesting to see the way, the college football playoff has unfolded so far. Because, again, everybody says, oh, well, Indiana, I don't know if they deserve to be in because Notre Dame beat them and it was pretty handy. Then you look at the next three games on Saturday and all of them played out pretty similarly. The better teams won. But that doesn't mean that, if we're going to have this, if we're going to have the 12-team playoff, this is what's going to happen. Because you look at, say, the FCS playoffs, for example. Much bigger than four teams. Usually it's the top seeds that end up making it, which I don't think should be a surprise to anyone. I think football has a lot less potential for chaos than college basketball does. Because, in college basketball, it's a lot easier for, say, a Jack Golke to come out of nowhere and take over a game. And, the opposing team, in Jack Golke's case, it was Kentucky, had no answers. Or in, say, NC State's case, DJ Burns. A player like that just taking over a game, that doesn't happen in football as easily as it does in basketball. Because in football, say, maybe Curtis Rourke could have taken over Friday's game, but, Notre Dame was giving him very, very complex looks in coverage and in their blitz packages as well. And that makes it tough on a quarterback. It's a lot easier in college basketball for chaos to happen. But in football, usually the bigger, stronger, faster, more physical team wins. And Kurt Cignetti said it. Jeremiah Love was slippery. Indiana couldn't catch him. Mike Kadick said they aren't the biggest group, but they are twitchy. They're quick. They're fast. They're tough. And that is why Notre Dame prevailed over Indiana on Friday night. Marcus Freeman has come a long way just this season as Notre Dame's head coach. You think back to the loss to Northern Illinois. Irish have now won 11 straight. They'll take on Georgia in the Sugar Bowl on New Year's Day at the Caesars Superdome. One round of the college football playoff is in the books. Indiana goes to the exits at 11-2. Hoosiers will look very different coming up next season. We'll talk a little bit more about that next here on IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday on WGCL, Nick Rotocap with you on this Sunday morning, and the holidays are in full swing, which means, of course, college football playoff postseason is here. And we'll close talking about the CFP by, just looking at the bigger picture for Indiana, which is, of course, that things get a lot tougher on the scheduling side next year. And Indiana went 11-1 the regular season this year. Of course, their lack of strength of schedule is something that was very well documented. One of the worst among the college football playoff teams. Doesn't mean they didn't deserve to be in, because you can only control how you handle your opponent. If you're a player, you can't control that opponent. And throughout the season, Indiana made it very clear that they deserve to at least have a shot. And I don't think anybody is going to dispute that. But when you have big conferences, this sort of thing is going to happen more and more. It's not an isolated thing for Indiana that they had a favorable Big Ten schedule, because the Big Ten, of course, now having 18 teams and no divisions means that not all conference schedules are going to be created equal. So you look at the Big Ten teams that Indiana played this year: UCLA, Maryland, Northwestern, Nebraska, Washington, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, Purdue. Ohio State, of course, a playoff team, dominated Tennessee last night, which will break the hearts of ESPN if it hasn't already. Michigan, the defending national champs, that had a down year. Michigan State, also in a down year because they fired their head coach and basically dealt with a very big roster shakeup. Washington, defending national runners-up, that had its coaching staff depart and subsequently a bunch of players left. Nebraska, a team that is bowl eligible but is, in the middle of a historic, I wouldn't say slump, but definitely not the program that they were in, say, the 80s and 90s. Northwestern, a team that is kind of meh. They were good in 2018 and 2020, but meh, I guess. Maryland, another team that was, again, bowl eligible, that went on to be 8-5 last year, but did not have a good season this year. UCLA, a team that was ranked in the top 20 of the college football playoff rankings late last season, but did not have a good year under first-year head coach Deshaun Foster. So, all that is to say that Indiana's Big Ten schedule was very favorable this season. Just the way it shook out. When you looked at Indiana's schedule at the time it was announced, it looked like a really tough schedule. But it did not play out that way. Move on to 2025. And Indiana's non-conference schedule is horrible. Let's just get that out of the way. Old Dominion, meh, at best. Kennesaw State, the worst FBS program in the country because they just came up from the FCS level and fired their head coach because they weren't getting the results they wanted, which is kind of disappointing because the transition to the FBS is so difficult, but they didn't like what they saw, so they canned him. And then Indiana State, a team that Purdue beat this year. And Purdue, as we know, was awful. Then you get to Indiana's conference schedule. It begins with a home game against Illinois. And for whatever reason, Indiana and Illinois always play each other close, even last year when Illinois was clearly the better team. Very weird. Then again, this year, Illinois and Purdue, were in a slugfest that ended, 50-47 in favor of Illinois. So that game should be interesting. That's on September 20th, 2025. That's Indiana's first Big Ten game. Then, this is the tough one. Iowa and Oregon, back-to-back games. There is a bye week in the middle of that, but they go to Iowa on September 27th, and then to Eugene, Oregon on October 11th. That is where we will see what next year's Indiana team is really made of. It'll be really early next season, relatively speaking. We won't have to wait until Michigan or Ohio State later in the year to see how they handle the big boys. Iowa plays this really weird brand of something called football. They don't really like to use the forward pass a whole lot, but they find ways to win games. So, they've got that going for them, I guess. And then Oregon, of course, the odds-on national title favorite this year, which, not surprising because they're the best team in the country. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that, although Ohio State could still make a pretty compelling case that they should be up there as well, as could Georgia. But yeah, Iowa and Oregon back-to-back weeks on the road for Indiana next year. Then they host Michigan State in the battle for the Old Brass Spittoon, which feels like it's earlier than usual next year, October 18th, that game. So Indiana returning home from Oregon. And then they'll host UCLA. And UCLA is interesting because Indiana quarterbacks coach Tino Sunseri is, of course, joining UCLA as the offensive coordinator out in Westwood for next season. And I wonder if Taven Jackson, who entered the transfer portal yesterday, by the way, good on him for waiting until after the college football playoff run was over to do it. He didn't have to do that, but he did. I wonder if Taven Jackson will follow Tino Sunseri to UCLA. That's something to keep an eye on. But UCLA comes to town looking for some revenge after that 42-13 loss that Indiana handed them at the Rose Bowl this season. And then it's Maryland on the road in College Park and Penn State on the road at State College. That is also a back-to-back. So 2-game stretches to keep an eye on for Indiana next season. Iowa and Oregon, there is a bye week in the middle of that, but it's Iowa, then Oregon. And then later on in the season, to begin November, Maryland and Penn State back-to-back. That is going to be tough. These are going to be tough road games in Big Ten play for Indiana. They did not fare well in their toughest road game of the year this year at Ohio State. Something to watch for next year. And then they close the season by hosting Wisconsin. Wisconsin, a team that took Oregon down to the wire in Madison this past season, versus Wisconsin and at Purdue. First-year head coach Barry Odom will have Purdue looking very different next year than Purdue looked this year. I don't know if that's good or bad, but Purdue really has nowhere to go but up after firing Ryan Walters. So again, you look at the road games that Indiana plays in the Big Ten next year. They go to Iowa. They go to Oregon. They go to Maryland. They go to Penn State. And they go to Purdue. It's going to be interesting to watch. So, the strength of schedule arguments for Indiana, or I guess against Indiana, in the non-conference slate next season, they're going to be about the same as this year. Well, they're not playing anybody. So if they win by 60 points, whatever. That's what they should do. If they were in the SEC, though, nobody would bat an eye, as we've seen, with the way Tennessee lost to Ohio State versus how Indiana lost to Notre Dame. But Indiana's non-conference schedule, those are teams that they should beat by 40, 50 points. I don't think there's any debate about that. The Big Ten schedule, as is going to be the case throughout the conference as long as we stay at this 18-team league with no divisions, you're going to see variance in the strength of schedule that Big Ten teams play, that SEC teams play, that Big 12 teams play. It's not unique to Indiana. Indiana got a bad draw for next year, but they got a very good draw this year, and they took advantage of it. Maybe we'll see some different teams take advantage of a weaker Big Ten schedule next year. That's just going to be the new norm in college football. But again, if you win your games, then you give yourself a chance to make the 12-team college football playoff. Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Texas A&M didn't win the games they were, supposed to win. Ole Miss losing to Kentucky at home. Alabama losing to Oklahoma, not even scoring a touchdown against 6-6 Oklahoma in Norman. Those are games that you're supposed to win. So unless Indiana falls into a trap like that next year, say if they can go to Iowa and win, if they can go to Oregon and keep it close like Ohio State did, if they can go to Penn State and keep it close, if they can go to Penn State and win like Ohio State did, then that'll be a step in the right direction, to say the least, for Indiana football in 2025. It's a roster that's going to look very, very different. Pretty much the entire offensive line is going to be different. It's going to need an overhaul. Very clear. Notre Dame made them look bad on Friday in South Bend. Offensive line's going to look different. Obviously, the quarterback room going to look very different. Tyler Cherry and Alberto Mendoza, the only two that are left. Curtis Rourke out of eligibility. Taven Jackson in the transfer portal. Bo Pribula, who was supposed to visit Indiana, did not. Probably for Indiana, looking at either Fernando Mendoza, the transfer from Cal, or Aaron Noland, the transfer from Ohio State. Something to keep an eye on in the coming days. I would expect Indiana to go after Fernando Mendoza, the California quarterback, in the transfer portal, because Fernando Mendoza's brother, Alberto Mendoza, is part of Indiana's current quarterback room. Mendoza did not play any games this year besides the Western Illinois game. He played late in that one. Mendoza, a true freshman this year. His brother, Fernando, played for a very fun team out east. Out east. Oh, they are in the ACC, so yeah, sure. But yeah, he played for Cal. I believe he has a relationship with Tino Sunseri, so maybe he goes to UCLA. But Mendoza, definitely a name to keep an eye on for Indiana in the transfer portal as they look to rebuild this roster once again going into 2025. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you on this Sunday morning just before 9 o'clock, and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. I sound like a broken record maybe, but Indiana men's basketball is weird. I'm gonna try to not be negative Nancy about Indiana men's basketball, because it's very easy. They make it very easy. But yesterday against Chattanooga, Indiana winning by 9. I believe they were favored by double digits, probably by 15 or so, against the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. Not exactly a powerhouse, but Chattanooga out of the Southern Conference played Indiana really close. Really, really close on the hardwood yesterday. 74-65 the final. It was a 3-point game at half, which seems to have become all too common for Mike Woodson coach teams. Of course, Indiana went to Nebraska and opened their second Big Ten game last Friday, the 13th, which might have been a bad omen from the jump, but they were in Lincoln. I was there calling the game on student radio. And that game was close at half, which, if you're an Indiana fan, you're thinking, okay, they can go on the road, they can play Nebraska close, this is good. It was tied with 7 minutes left, and then they did not make a field goal for the final 7 minutes of the game. They went 8 of 35 from 3-point range in that game against Nebraska. And then Indiana faces Tennessee Chattanooga on Saturday at noon. I did not watch most of that game because I was still trying to catch up on sleep from the Notre Dame game. Got home at about 5 a.m. That was fun. But Indiana, I turned it on in the second half, and I'm like, what in the world is going on? Indiana went 5 of 20 from three-point range after going 8 for 35 against Nebraska. Indiana just 11 of 20 from the free throw line against Chattanooga. Chattanooga was 7 for 10 from the stripe and 10 of 28 from downtown. The numbers are just bad for Indiana at this point. And, it's one thing if, they play a Purdue-level non-conference schedule where you play a bunch of really tough teams. Purdue has played, just off the top of my head, Marquette, Auburn. They got blown out by Auburn yesterday. Yes, they did. But Purdue has played Marquette, Auburn, Alabama, Texas A&M. 4 top college basketball teams. Indiana has played South Carolina, Gonzaga, and Louisville. They got blown out by 20-plus points in 2 of those games. Only game they won was South Carolina, and that was at home. You look at the rest of their non-conference games, we've been over this, they are not good. Not quality opponents. So when you're playing weak opponents, it's kind of like football. If you're playing bad opponents, you're supposed to beat them by a lot. Indiana is not doing that. And I know, some people are going to say, oh, well, why are you mad that Indiana basketball is winning? It's because when you play soft non-conference opponents and you don't beat them by a lot, that's something that the selection committee looks at. That's something that the metrics take into account. Who did you play and how did you play them? And if you didn't beat bad teams by lots of points, then they're going to look at that and say, maybe you shouldn't be selected for the NCAA tournament. And you look at Joe Lunardi's bracketology from a couple days ago, he had Indiana as one of the next 4 teams out, not even one of the first 4 out, one of the next 4 out. Indiana now is in a position where they have to go on a serious tear in Big Ten play if they want to make the big dance. And that's something that is tough for anyone to do. But if you're only shooting, say, 25% from 3, or if you're shooting 8 for 35 from 3 and just over 50% from the free throw line on any given night, it's going to be tough to win any Big Ten games. If you're only beating Chattanooga by 9 at home, it's going to be tough to win Big Ten games. And Indiana, in the middle of this big home stretch that they're playing right now, they're going to go on the road for 4 of their next 5 after they play Rutgers on January 2nd. They go to Penn State. They play them at the Palestra. Indiana, of course, not very good at winning at Penn State. Then they host USC and go on the road to Iowa. They host Illinois. Then they play in Columbus at Northwestern, and they go to Purdue on January 31st. And then they go to Wisconsin, where they haven't won since 1998. It's going to be very tough for Indiana men's basketball moving forward here. So that's why when people get mad about Indiana only beating Chattanooga by 9, that is what they're talking about. It's those kinds of things. It's one thing if, Indiana didn't lose by 17 at Nebraska, but they did. That's why people aren't encouraged, and that's why people are so frustrated with Mike Woodson. Lots of resources to build this roster, a large monetary investment, multiple millions of dollars into this roster, and they still just look flat against teams they shouldn't look flat against. We'll talk more about that coming up here on WGCL. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rodecap with you, recapping Indiana men's basketball's a little bit too close win over Chattanooga yesterday, 74-65, the Hoosiers over the Mocs at Assembly Hall in their second-to-last non-conference game of the year. And we talked about it a little bit before the break, but Indiana, their three-point shooting woes continue. Over their last 2 games, the Hoosiers are now 13 of 55. 13 of 55. From three-point range. They were 8 of 35 against Nebraska last Friday. They were 5 of 20 against Chattanooga yesterday. And Mackenzie Mbako had 3 of those 4 made three-point field goals. Luke Goody had 1, and Trey Galloway had 1. Malik Renew 0 for 2. Miles Rice 0 for 4. Kanan Carlisle 0 for 3. Now, I'm not a rocket scientist, but that's not good for Indiana. because we knew after last season, this is something that's been talked about quite a bit, Indiana had to find perimeter shooters. And on paper, I would say they did. I would say that they did find three-point shooters. You think about Miles Rice, you think about Luke Goody. Yeah, guys who can shoot the three ball. Mackenzie Mbako has certainly been that this season for Indiana. And he was 3 for 4 yesterday. 14 points in 25 minutes for him. But just bad numbers as a team for Indiana. And that's not unique at all to that game. Again, it's just something that happens far too often for Indiana. But 29 of 58 from the floor, which isn't necessarily that bad. But again, 5 of 20 from 3, just over 50%, 11 of 20 from the line. Malik Reneau 0 for 3 at the stripe. Trey Galloway 1 for 2, which obviously you can live with. Mackenzie Mbako 1 for 2. Oumar Ballo 5 of 7, which is actually encouraging for him, of course, because he switched to that left-handed free throw before the start of this season after some pretty bad career numbers. But maybe it was a change of hairstyle was all he needed, because he had that afro yesterday, which I believe Don Fisher described as it looked like his head exploded. But hey, if you look good, you play good. And Ballo had 9 points, 8 boards, 4 assists yesterday. So you'll take it if you're Indiana. But only beating Chattanooga by 9 points, it just isn't. That's not convincing. In Indiana had some time off. Indiana had 8 days off. Obviously, it was because of finals week at IU. But that's something that I feel like should have led to Indiana winning by more points, and should have led to Indiana not letting Chattanooga hang in that game for so long. Their biggest lead of the game, and I believe it was about halfway through the second half, their biggest lead of the game was 7 points. Chattanooga isn't exactly a powerhouse. I would say that's a fair assessment of them. They're 175th in KenPom, which is right about halfway out of the 364 teams in Division I men's college basketball. Chattanooga, right about halfway. I mean, they're around teams like UT Arlington, Brown, Drexel, Appy State, Indiana State. Not good teams. So that's why you need to beat them by more than 9 points. Indiana, after yesterday, is 56th in KenPom, the computer metrics, of course. Right behind Nebraska, actually, because a big part of that is that Nebraska lost by 37 points at Michigan State. Michigan State, by the way, is 22nd in KenPom. So Indiana now at 56th in KenPom, 9-3 on the season. They will host Winthrop next Sunday. Next Sunday, Indiana hosts Winthrop, their final non-conference game of the year. Winthrop, let's just do some more searching on KenPom. Winthrop is 184th, so they're right around Chattanooga. They're 9 spots lower than Chattanooga is. Winthrop is 10-4. They're in the Big South Conference. Chattanooga 8-5 in the Southern Conference. Indiana should beat Winthrop by a lot on paper. That is not a crazy thing to say. They should. Indiana should win by a lot. But how many times now have we said that? Have we said that Indiana should beat a team by a lot, and then for whatever reason it just doesn't happen? I know that, people might say, oh, well, this is just Indiana's fan base being entitled. This is Indiana's fan base being cranky, being insufferable, finding anything to complain about. But when you don't play how you're supposed to play against bad teams, and then you repeatedly look terrible against good teams, people are going to want something to change. And I think that, especially when the same talking points are recycled over and over and over, like yesterday Mike Woodson said his starters played horribly. Whose job is it to get them ready? Whose job is it to make sure that they don't play horribly? It's the coach. It's not rocket science. and I get it. Like, these are college kids. These are kids my age, early 20s. Some of them not even that old. Bryson Tucker is a true freshman. But there has been a massive, massive investment in NIL for Indiana men's basketball. Millions of dollars to attract what was supposed to be some of the biggest talent in the transfer portal. Bryson Tucker, a pro-style prospect coming in as a freshman. And the results on the floor don't reflect that right now for Indiana. I would say it's early in the season, but it's not anymore. We're more than a third of the way there now. March isn't that far away. Indiana is on the bubble, I'd say, of the NCAA tournament right now. Obviously, there's still a lot of time left. It's not early in the season, but it's also not late. Indiana can turn it around, They can really flip the script. Who knows? Maybe they beat the brakes off Winthrop, and then they play Rutgers, and they beat the snot out of them, too. Rutgers has two very talented players in Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper. But Rutgers is kind of in a similar situation right now where they might miss the NCAA tournament. They lost to Princeton yesterday at home. Thrilling finish to that game. Rutgers 81st in KenPom. So they're in a similar spot to Indiana in that they have talent, but they just haven't quite put it together. Rutgers is 7-5. So these are games that are going to mean a lot for the purpose of NCAA tournament implications, seeding, selection, that sort of thing. These are games that Indiana's going to have to play well in now. You're going to have to go to Penn State. You're going to have to give them a fight. If you remember back to last year, Indiana did not do that. You're going to have to play USC, which I don't even know. USC men's basketball is right behind Rutgers and KenPom, 82nd. Not exactly world beaters here. These aren't unwinnable games by any means. Iowa, a little bit tougher. They're 44th. So again, these are games that Indiana should be in on paper. But don't hold your breath, because if Mike Woodson is the head coach, then you're in for some letdowns, as was the case yesterday when Indiana only beat Chattanooga by 9 points. I sound like a pessimist, I do, but it's hard to argue with results. We can talk about hypotheticals all day. I know SEC football fans love to do that. They love to talk about hypotheticals. By the way, the SEC as a basketball conference is unbelievable right now. Unbelievable what is going on in the SEC. It's insane. Basically, the whole conference is good, which Indiana's win against South Carolina is going to start looking better because South Carolina right now, they're 68th in KenPom, but they're 8-3. Basically, the whole SEC is good, but that's a discussion for another time. We can play the hypothetical game all day with what Indiana is supposed to do. The fact of the matter is they have not lived up to expectations so far. There is time for them to turn it around, but they're going to have to start doing that sooner rather than later. Because obviously you don't play every game at home. Indiana's won every game at home, but they haven't looked convincing on neutral courts aside from the game against Providence, which they needed 2 blowout losses prior to before they played well in that game. And then obviously the big loss at Nebraska, which was a close game until the shooters just decided to leave the building. So that's something to keep an eye on. As we enter Big Ten play for Indiana men's basketball, they have 6 days off. They will play Winthrop next week. And then we'll go from there into Big Ten play. It's an exciting time for IU sports. Football season is over, so the focus now shifts fully to basketball, which I think this is the latest that's happened in a pretty long time. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you. The last Sunday before Christmas, and Indiana football season came to a close against Notre Dame. It's something that we kind of saw for Indiana against Ohio State, and I wanted to kind of talk about it in depth here while there's been some time to digest the loss in South Bend for Indiana football on Friday night in the first round of the college football playoff. It wasn't like Notre Dame took Indiana for 50 points. It wasn't like Notre Dame gave Indiana the Florida State treatment that Georgia gave them. It was 65-3 or something last year after both teams got left out of the last 14 playoff. That wasn't really the case. It wasn't like Indiana. The final score was deceiving for Indiana. Yes, it was. It was 27-3. But you go sort of blow by blow in that game, and it felt like it was worse than it actually was. Because in the stadium, Notre Dame had all the momentum after Jeremiah Love's 98-yard touchdown run. And that goes to show really how small the margin for error is in college football at the top level. That's something Curt Cignetti has talked about throughout the season. He stressed it a lot in the middle of the year. He said, you've got to be constantly improving because at this level, the difference between victory and defeat is, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, the difference between victory and defeat is razor thin. Everybody's good at this level of college football. One little mismatch inside for for Indiana's defense that led to the Notre Dame touchdown run that got the crowd rocking. Jeremiah Love's 98-yard rip. He is going to be phenomenal for Notre Dame. He's fantastic to watch. But that mismatch comes after Curtis Rourke tries to force a football into a tight window and just can't connect over the middle. Xavier Watts is right there, well-positioned because he's one of the best defensive backs in the country. He makes the pick. Love rips it. That's that. Those are the kinds of things that you can't have happen. And Curtis Rourke took accountability for it, as you would expect him to do. Veteran quarterback leader. After the game, said, hey, I've got to be better. It was an execution thing. And Indiana offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan said the same thing. Said it wasn't like Rourke was necessarily making bad decisions a lot of the time, although that throw across the middle that led to the interception might have been a bad decision. Most of his decisions were good. It's just that they didn't execute. Sounds simple, but yeah, if you have a great game plan, that's one thing. You've still got to go out and you've got to make sure that you follow that game plan. And Indiana was not able to do that for the vast majority of Friday's game. A couple mismatches, some poorly thrown balls by Rourke. It felt like Indiana was playing a little scared, to be honest. It really did. It felt like they were playing not to lose rather than to win. And there's the saying, prevent defense prevents winning. I think the idea can also be applied on the offensive side that if you're playing timid, if you're playing because you're afraid to fail, then that can actually hurt you more than it helps. I've experienced this myself as it relates to athletics on a much lesser scale, obviously, than 100,000 people screaming at you in prime time on national television. It's a very, very different stage, but the mentality thing is kind of the same. You think about, I'm going to use bowling as an example. If you're trying to make a 10-pin in bowling, it's the toughest spare to make as a right-handed bowler because you've got to get the ball near the edge of the lane, the right edge of the lane, because obviously the 10-pin, back right corner of the lane, right by the gutter. You've got to get the ball far enough to the right to where you can obviously bury the 10-pin, but you've also got to keep it from falling off the lane and going into the ditch. And if you try to place the ball in the perfect spot, you're never going to make the spare, especially as a two-handed bowler. It just doesn't work. You've got to let it rip. You got to trust your mechanics. You've got to trust your coaching. You've got to trust your training. And you just got to let it rip. You've got to know that your preparation, that your physical training, that your mechanics, those are all going to lead you to being able to just let it rip and just bury that 10-pin every single time. And professional bowlers are really good at that. They make the 10-pin about 95% of the time. I do not, because sometimes I get scared and I'm like, oh boy, I threw my last one in the ditch. I'd better not do that this time. It's the same kind of idea when it comes to playing scared. In any sport, not just football, but in any sport. If you're playing not to lose because you're afraid of failure, you're probably going to lose. So I think that was kind of what happened to Indiana on Friday, especially with Curtis Rourke early in the passing game. Indiana had that tip drill interception on Notre Dame's first drive. That sets you up with fantastic field position. And then, it just looks like Rourke is just kind of trying to place the ball. Think of it as like pitching in baseball, same kind of thing. How many times have you heard, say, a parent or a coach at the youth level of baseball tell a pitcher just throw strikes? Oh, well, that's a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? But if you're trying to place the ball, if you're trying to pinpoint where you want to locate your pitches, you're not going to be successful. You can try. Maybe you're Greg Maddux. But by and large, if you're thinking, oh, man, I really can't I can't walk another guy. Oh, man, I can't miss with my curveball. You're going to miss with your curveball. You just got to let it rip. Curtis Rourke was not letting it rip like we've seen him do so much in an Indiana uniform. That was not the case by and large until about, 5 minutes left in the game, at which point Indiana was down 27-3. Pressure's off then, sure. But I would have loved to see Indiana playing like and coaching like they had nothing to lose from the jump, because that's the case. Nobody expected Indiana to get there. Nobody on the outside expected Indiana to make the college football playoff at the start of the season. But they did. And it's way, way easier for me to say on the outside looking in. I understand that. But if you're Indiana and you're in that spot, you're on the road, everybody counted you out. You've been overlooked. You've been looked down upon as well throughout the season. You got nothing to lose. You got to play free. You got to play like you're playing with house money, because Indiana was. And unfortunately for them, they just couldn't come through. I think I would have liked to see them, and again, part of that was just Rourke not being able to make the throws. Outside of that one sideline catch made by Elijah Surratt early in that game, Indiana didn't have a whole lot going for them in the passing game. And when you're a pass-first offense, it's all or nothing, unfortunately. Notre Dame's secondary was so good. I'm sure that played a part in it as well. Mike Shanahan, Indiana's offensive coordinator, described them as one of the best units they've seen all season. They will spell big trouble, I'm sure, for Georgia's backup quarterback, Gunnar Stockton, in the Sugar Bowl. That is a game that Georgia will have to win on the ground by way of guys like Trevor Etienne and that offensive line. They've got some dogs up there. Well, they're all dogs. They're the Georgia Bulldogs. But that's a game where you'll see Georgia probably go run heavy, especially after what Notre Dame was able to do in keeping Curtis Rourke quiet until very late in that game. So I would have liked to see Indiana playing more free, playing looser, not playing to lose, or not playing out of failure of losing, out of out of fear of failure, playing more free because they had nothing to lose. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way, and Indiana had to go conservative, punting from the other side of the 50 because the offense could not get anything going. It's tough, but the margin of error is small. And Indiana made a couple mistakes. That interception, the Jeremiah Love touchdown run, because of a mismatch in the box. And from there, they were on their heels. And that is how Notre Dame was able to run away with that game. They were very methodical in the way they were moving the ball. It wasn't big splash plays. It was 7 yards here, 5 yards there, little chunks at a time. That was ultimately what did Indiana in. The defense just could not get off the field because of how Notre Dame was able to move the ball. That comes down to, I think, more talented players, especially in the trenches, quicker, more physical, faster, just twitchier. And those are the kinds of players that Indiana is going to have an easier time recruiting moving forward because of the success Curt Cignetti had this season. Getting Indiana onto these stages, selling out Memorial Stadium 4 times to close the year, those are the kinds of things that will help you attract more talent moving forward and will ultimately help Indiana football contend in the college football playoff in the long run. So yeah, big picture, everything is going to be all right. Curt Cignetti You got to trust him, said Indiana defensive lineman James Carpenter, because he is just getting started. And you are listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you on this Sunday morning. And in just about 2.5 hours from now, Indiana women's basketball will close their non-conference schedule against the Oakland Golden Grizzlies. And I will actually be heading to Assembly Hall to call that game on Big Ten Plus right after this. So that'll be a little hustle to get over there. But Indiana facing Oakland 12 p.m. today to close their non-conference slate. The Hoosiers are coming off back-to-back impressive wins. One over Penn State. That was a long time ago. It was about 2 weeks ago. The other against Bellarmine last week. And it's kind of been a reversal of fortunes for them as of late, once the calendar flipped to December, because you think back to the way their season started, it was not very good. We knew that it was going to be a little bit of a step back for Indiana after the departures of Mackenzie Holmes and Sarah Scalia, but they fell to Harvard, that upset loss in overtime at Assembly Hall, and then the loss to Butler that followed. And you think about kind of a wake-up call. That is certainly something that fits that bill for Indiana women's basketball. Those two early losses, their first loss at home in 2 seasons was the loss to Harvard. Then they rebounded. They rebounded well. They beat Stanford sizably, 79-66. And then the 2 wins in the Bahamas, one over Columbia and then one over then number 18 Baylor. That was when you kind of knew that, yeah, it was just kind of a bump in the road for Indiana. Sure, they lost by 30 to North Carolina, but they got to the championship in the Battle for Atlantis, which I think you'll take if you're Indiana. Then they come back home. They beat Maine. They beat Southern Indiana. And then the 2 big wins that we just talked about. 15 points on the road at Penn State in Shea Chesky's homecoming. That was big for Indiana. Starting Big Ten play 1-0. And it was Yarden Garzone who kind of led the way. And that's something that we've seen a lot of. But also the big one, Caroline Strickland coming in off the bench, the Tennessee transfer. A perfect 12 of 12 from the floor. 27 points and 4 rebounds for her. That is something that has become a theme sort of for Indiana over the last couple games, is production off the bench. Bellarmine, obviously a lesser quality opponent than Penn State, but Indiana in that game had a ton of bench points from players that, we haven't really seen a lot of throughout the season, but 45 bench points, 95 total points, so nearly a 1-to-1 split of points from the starters and points from the bench. Caroline Strickland, again, had 18 in that game. Henna Sandvik had a career-high 13, as well as 6 rebounds. Strickland had 8 rebounds, nearly a double-double. Sandvik had 13 and 6. And then Lexis Bargesser, who missed some time early in the season with an injury. 11 points, a rebound, 4 assists for her off the bench as well. And some big minutes for the bench players for Indiana women's basketball. Strickland, Sandvik, and Bargesser all playing over 18 minutes in that game. And Strickland, really high percentage scorer from inside, 7 of 10 from the floor against Bellarmine last week. You'd expect something similar from that unit today against Oakland, because Oakland is not a team that Indiana women's basketball should struggle with. They just simply are not very good. As far as Horizon League team goes, Oakland teams go, I should say, Oakland is near the bottom in a lot of categories, in rebounding margin, point margin, turnover differential. The only thing that they're really good at is forcing turnovers, but they're really poor on the boards. They're really poor shooting under 30% from 3 as a team, which I think they're going to need some production from outside to have any chance of hanging with Indiana today. But I don't think that they're going to give Indiana anything that they haven't seen. Go back to that Bellarmine game again. Indiana, 10 of 26 from 3. That's nearly 50%. You'd like to see them be better from the free throw line, I think. 11 of 17. As far as the numbers that we're used to seeing from Indiana women's basketball, not as good as you'd like. You think back to players like Sarah Scalia, who shot about 90% from the line. Shea Chesky did not get to the line a lot, only once. But again, Indiana put up 95. So you'll take the production however you can get it. But I think it's encouraging for Indiana women's basketball to get that production from your bench unit, again, with the season-long absences now of Lene Beaumont and Faith Wiseman, I think, was the other player who had a procedure and will be out for the season. Beaumont, obviously, the bigger loss because you were hoping to see some more minutes from her in year 2. She showed some flashes last year as a freshman, some potential, but she is out for the season. The team announced a few days ago that she had a successful procedure on her knee. She'll miss the rest of the year, but she'll be back and ready for the 25-26 season, which is good to see. Terry Morin, not a head coach that usually goes very deep into the bench, but Indiana playing a bunch of different players against Bellarmine and against Penn State even as well. Going 8 deep, going 9 deep. In the case of Bellarmine, they went 11 deep. 11 different players logging minutes in that game, with 8 of those players playing at least 18 minutes. That's big for Indiana. You're going to need that kind of depth. Obviously, it's not easy to replace all-American caliber players like Mackenzie Holmes, but if you can do it in aggregate with players like Lily Meister and Caroline Striplin, who combined for 27 points against Bellarmine to go along with 14 rebounds as well, that is an encouraging sign for Indiana moving forward. They'll have one final non-conference game against Oakland at noon today, that game on Big Ten Plus, and then they will dive into Big Ten play in earnest. And the Big Ten is a conference that, with the addition of the West Coast schools, is even more stacked than it already was. Obviously, Iowa taking a little bit of a step back, as did Indiana, of course. But looking at the AP poll, you got a bunch of teams in the top 25. USC up there. They played a thrilling game against UConn last night, squeaked out the win on the road in Connecticut, which is very, very impressive. UCLA, though, at the top. They are 10-0. USC, Maryland, Ohio State, Michigan, Iowa, Nebraska. Just so much talent in the Big Ten on the women's basketball side. Indiana begins Big Ten play with Wisconsin on the 28th. That is next Saturday at Assembly Hall. 2 p.m. tip there. And then the big one, right off the bat, as soon as the calendar flips to 2025, UCLA comes to town, the current number 1 team in the country. January 4th, 12 p.m. Whew. Man, you think back to the Iowa game last year when Caitlin Clark came to town. Iowa was the number 3 team in the land at that point. Indiana, that game was never close. Indiana won that game going away. The one advantage I think UCLA is going to have in that game, as far as the atmosphere is concerned, is that the students will still be on break. And because IU started a week later than normal this year, IU will not go back until the 13th of January. So the students will not have come back at that point yet. That's going to be tough for Indiana women's basketball. I think if they can keep that game close, it'll be very encouraging for them moving forward in Big Ten play. Because then they go to Northwestern. Northwestern is not very good. Last year, Indiana hung 100 on them when they came to Assembly Hall. It was like 100-65 or something. So that's a game where you could look at it kind of as a get-right game. Obviously, it's on the road. But then Indiana goes to Iowa. Iowa's still a top 25 team. Hannah Stolke kind of taking the reins for them now. Then they host Illinois, and then they'll host USC. USC, of course, just beat UConn last night. Juju Watkins, the best player in the country. One of. There's so much talent in women's college basketball. Juju Watkins right at the top of that list. That game is going to be a whiteout for Indiana women's basketball, I believe, which is it's going to be cool. It's going to be very cool because, like I said, the Iowa game, I should say, last year was a whiteout for Indiana women's basketball, and the atmosphere was great. The students will be back at that point. That's the first Sunday after the spring semester starts. Sunday afternoon tip. It's going to be fun. Assembly Hall is a very tough place to win at on the women's side. Indiana 5-1. Obviously, the loss to Harvard was kind of puzzling, but Indiana's figured it out since then. So if you got a chance to go to either the UCLA or the USC game in the coming weeks, do it, because it's those are going to be some fun atmospheres. And women's college basketball still on the rise. It's going to be fun to watch. But the women today host Oakland in their final non-conference game at noon, and it should be a good one. Indiana's bench will probably get big minutes in that game as Indiana looks to tune up heading into league play. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday on WGCL, it's kind of a little bit of a lull right now. In IU athletics as a whole, of course, around the holidays, that does tend to happen. Finals, Christmas coming up this week, just kind of a little bit of a dead period. There's a whole lot of nothing going on really for the next few days after women's basketball today. Obviously, if Indiana made the second round of the college football playoff, it'd be a little different, but beggars can't be choosers. So the women play at Assembly Hall today. They've actually got the next two. Oakland today, Wisconsin next Saturday. And then men's basketball is back at it against Winthrop. They're closing their non-conference slate as well. Wrestling has a couple events going on. They are at the Ken Craft Midlands Championships next weekend, the 29th and the 30th in Illinois. Northwestern is hosting that. The Big Ten, it's a pretty much an everything conference at this point. There's a team competing at a really high level in pretty much every single sport. Wrestling is no exception to that rule. Teams like Illinois, Penn State, up there among the best. Indiana did not play well, or did not perform well, I should say, against Illinois when they faced off in Indianapolis a few weeks ago. But the Hoosiers, 4-1 on the season as a team. They've got the Ken Craft Championships in Illinois. Again, that's next weekend. And then they will host Rutgers at Wilkinson Hall on January 10th. That's the Friday before the spring semester starts in Bloomington. And then men's basketball back at it against Rutgers on Thursday, January 2nd. Their third Big Ten game of the season. Of course, it's all Big Ten games from then on out. And, man, it's going to be intriguing to see how Mike Woodson and Indiana handle the Big Ten schedule this year, especially that string of 4 out of 5 road games coming up in January. There's a chance that it goes very wrong based on what we've seen so far this year. Like I said, there's also a chance it turns around. I don't want to be negative Nancy, but the early returns are not encouraging for Indiana men's basketball, given the talent that they have on that roster. Swim and Dive rolls on in Gainesville, Florida on Friday, January 3rd. And rowing is in there as well. But yeah, it's a very, very slow time for IU athletics. And man, it's kind of, I think, deserved. I don't know if deserved is the right word. But there's been a lot of stuff happening very fast over this last handful of weeks and these last few months. Just hasn't really set in yet. I haven't had a lot of time to reflect on the football season, having covered the team all season long, I should say, from Big Ten Media Days to the first home game against FIU, which had a lot of people dressed as seats there, and then just watching the place fill up for the final 4 games of the year at home: Nebraska, Washington, Michigan, Purdue. It was awesome. It was so cool, and as a member of student media, it was really cool to experience it, to be up close and personal, to be on the field for the Purdue game. That was really, really cool. It was such an amazing experience, and it's really, really awesome to see what a good football program can do for a university as a whole. I know that IU historically obviously has been a basketball school, but to see IU become a football school, it's phenomenal. And I think Indiana being good in football is good for college football. I think with this 12-team playoff, you're going to see some new faces. You still might have your traditional powers at the top. I'm not trying to argue that everything's going to get flipped on its head, because so far throughout the 12-team playoff, that has not been the case. But to see some new faces on the big stage is good for college football. you'd like to see the talent get spread out a little more. If you're Indiana, you're going to have to start trying to attract some of those bigger name recruits, some of those bigger name portal players, because you've proven that you can get to the big stage. Now you want to hang with the big boys. Hang with the Notre Dames. Hang with the Oregons. Hang with the Ohio States of the world. You already beat Michigan. I know Michigan had a down year. Michigan's still one of the big boys in college football. They're not going to be down for long. So you get your wins over them while you can. Indiana has more wins over Michigan since 2020 than Ohio State does. Just food for thought. Just food for thought. I know they didn't play in 2020, but still, numbers don't lie. Indiana's beaten Michigan more than Ohio State has since 2020. So, really, really awesome what Curt Cignetti has done for Indiana as a university, not just the football program, as a university. There was a buzz around campus this semester that I haven't experienced in my time here, just obviously 3 years, not that much by any means. But there was a buzz around campus and around the city that was refreshing. It was really, really cool to experience. So it's a sign of things to come for Indiana football. Again, James Carpenter said it. Sig's going to get it done. He's just getting started. The roster's going to look very different. There's a lot that we don't know. It's going to happen pretty fast with the transfer portal. As far as the recruiting goes, I'd expect some shakeups, obviously, throughout spring ball as well. But with that coaching staff pretty much staying intact, aside from Tino Sunseri going out west to UCLA, the coaching staff is going to be the same come next season, and that is encouraging. Sig's here, I think, for the long haul, and he's going to get it done. He put Indiana football on the map. I'd expect that to continue moving into the future. That's going to do it here for us on IU Sports Sunday. We've got Colts football coming up on WGCL. The Titans are in town. It's a whiteout at Lucas Oil Stadium. The Colts' playoff hopes all but dead after a putrid loss to Denver last week. I wonder if Jonathan Taylor walked home from Highmark Stadium, from Mile High, whatever it's called now. It might be Highmark Stadium. I don't know. I hope he walked home from Denver, because dropping the football at the one, especially as a veteran running back, not something you want to do. Pre-game starts at noon. Matt Taylor, Rick Venturi, Lara Overton have you covered at 1 p.m. Eastern. You've been listening to IU Sports Sunday.